The night was thick with silence, the kind that only comes just before a storm. The wind whistled softly between the cracks of the nearby buildings, carrying with it the distant hum of a city winding down after a long day. But on this street, in the heart of the city's forgotten corner, the air was electric. The low rumble of motorcycle engines echoed through the alleyway, cutting through the quiet like a knife. The bikers rolled in one by one, revving their engines as they came to a stop. They were a rough-looking crew, leather jackets, tattoos, and eyes that seemed to glow with a mix of arrogance and boredom. They had no real destination. No real purpose. Just the thrill of the night, the thrill of doing whatever they wanted. And tonight, it was going to be Chuck Norris. They had spotted him standing under a flickering streetlight. A solitary figure in a black jacket, looking almost out of place in the midst of their chaos. He stood there alone, calm, unbothered by the noise or the violence that surrounded him. He was everything they weren't, controlled, focused, and in command of his space. The leader of the gang, a tall man named Danny, who went by the nickname Razor because of his sharp, piercing eyes, was the first to approach. His motorcycle roared to a halt in front of Chuck, and he threw off his helmet, revealing a face twisted in a perpetual smirk. "Hey, old man," Razor called, his voice loud and mocking. "You lost or something?" Chuck Norris didn't flinch. He didn't look at Razor, didn't acknowledge him. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, his eyes focused on something far beyond the noise and chaos of the bikers. The gang grew uneasy. Razor wasn't used to being ignored. He stepped off his bike, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He was used to commanding attention, to having people bend to his will. This was supposed to be easy. This guy, this old man standing there, was nothing. But there was something in the way he stood, the way he held himself. It wasn't like anyone Razor had ever met before. "Didn't you hear me, old man?" Razor's voice dropped, more threatening now. "I asked if you're lost." Chuck Norris's eyes finally moved, but they didn't focus on Razor. They simply shifted, narrowing slightly as though considering the situation. Then, without a word, he turned his head, staring straight ahead at the empty street. His demeanor was calm, too calm for Razor to feel comfortable. "You really don't want to do this," Chuck's voice was quiet, measured. But there was power behind the words, a weight to them that made Razor hesitate for just a second. The hesitation didn't last long. Razor was used to being in control. He wasn't going to let some stranger stand there and act like he was the one calling the shots. "You're really starting to annoy me, old man," Razor snarled. "I think it's time you leave, before things get ugly." Chuck Norris didn't move. He didn't even raise an eyebrow. His calm presence made Razor angry, and it made the other bikers nervous. They had all seen men crumble under Razor's threats before, but there was something different about this one. Something about Chuck that didn't fit. The gang circled closer, their motorcycles creating a tight ring around him. Razor cracked his knuckles, a signal that he was ready to escalate things. The others followed suit, their eyes scanning the area, looking for a reason to strike. "You know what?" Razor said, his voice dripping with venom. "I think it's time for a lesson. You don't belong here, old man. This street? It belongs to us. Now, get the hell out." He lunged forward, his fist swinging through the air toward Chuck's face. The speed was impressive, fast enough to land a solid punch on most people. But Chuck Norris was not like most people. In a flash, Chuck's hand shot up, grabbing Razor's wrist mid-air. The force was so sudden and so precise that Razor didn't even realize what was happening until he felt the intense pressure on his arm. Before he could react, Chuck twisted, pulling Razor's arm behind his back in one smooth motion. Razor grunted, trying to fight against the hold, but it was futile. Chuck had him in a lock he couldn't escape. His breath came in short bursts, panic starting to creep into his chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. "Let go of me." Razor spat, his face contorted with rage. Chuck didn't respond. He didn't need to. His grip remained firm, but there was no violence in his movements, just a calm, controlled precision. Razor, despite his attempts, couldn't break free. The more he struggled, the more it became apparent that Chuck was holding back, waiting, testing. The rest of the bikers watched in stunned silence. They had expected a quick fight, something they could laugh about later over beers. But this was different. Chuck wasn't just some old man. He was a force. And they had no idea what they were up against. Finally, Chuck released Razor, pushing him forward into the dirt. Razor landed hard, scraping his palms against the rough pavement. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What the hell are you?" he asked, his voice shaking. Chuck didn't answer. He simply turned, walking away without a second glance. The bikers stood frozen, their confidence shattered. Razor, still on the ground, watched Chuck's retreating figure with a mixture of fear and awe. He was used to being the one in control, the one who decided when a fight ended. But this was different. One of the other bikers, a large man with tattoos covering his arms, stepped forward. "That's it? He just walks away." Razor didn't say anything. His mind was racing. He'd been bested, no, humiliated, in front of his gang. That wasn't something he could easily accept. But the rest of the gang was uneasy. Something didn't sit right. They had never seen a fight like this before. No one fought like that. And no one, no matter how tough, walked away from Razor like that. "What should we do now?" another biker asked, his voice low, his eyes still on Chuck's disappearing figure. Razor shook his head, his jaw clenched in frustration. "We leave. This isn't over. Not by a long shot." But as they started to turn their bikes around, something caught their eye. A shadow moved in the alleyway behind them. Someone had been watching the entire scene unfold. The figure stepped out of the darkness, revealing a tall, slim man with a hood pulled low over his face. He said nothing, just stood there, observing them with piercing eyes. The bikers froze, unsure of what to do. Razor didn't recognize the man, but there was something about him that felt wrong. Something about the way he moved, the way his presence seemed to cut through the air like a blade. Before anyone could speak, the figure turned, disappearing into the night just as quietly as he had come. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared to speak. For a moment, it felt as though the air itself had shifted, leaving behind a lingering sense of unease. Chuck Norris had walked away, but it was clear that there was more to the story. More than they could have possibly imagined. The bikers were shaken, their confidence shattered in an instant. Chuck Norris had walked away from them like they were nothing, leaving them to grapple with the questions they couldn't answer. Razor, still nursing his pride, stared at the spot where Chuck had disappeared. There was a lingering tension in the air, a sense of something unfinished, something unresolved. "What the hell just happened?" one of the bikers muttered, his voice barely audible. "Shut up," Razor snapped, though he wasn't sure if it was directed at the biker or at himself. He was furious. No one had ever done that to him before. But Chuck had been something different. He wasn't just some old man standing under a streetlight. There was a calmness in him, a confidence that Razor couldn't place. It had thrown him off guard. That wasn't supposed to happen. Razor looked down at his hands, the same hands that had thrown punches and wielded knives without hesitation. But now, they felt weak, almost useless. There was an unfamiliar feeling in his chest, something that wasn't anger or fear but uncertainty. "I don't know what's going on here, but we're not letting this slide," Razor growled, his voice low and dangerous. "We find him. We make him pay for this." The other bikers didn't respond immediately. They all exchanged uneasy glances. They had no idea who this guy was or why he seemed untouchable, but they knew one thing: they didn't want to cross him again. But Razor wouldn't let it go. Not now. Not after being humiliated in front of his own crew. He wasn't going to let an old man walk away from him like that. Not when the streets were his, when his reputation was at stake. "We find him," Razor repeated, his voice more forceful this time. But just as the group was about to start their bikes and head out, something caught their attention, a rustling noise coming from the shadows behind them. They turned, expecting to see nothing, but the figure from earlier, the one who had stepped out of the alley, was standing there once again. His face was still hidden under the hood, but his presence was unmistakable. Cold. Unyielding. "Who the hell are you?" Razor demanded, his anger bubbling to the surface. He took a step forward, but something in the figure's stance made him pause. The stranger didn't move an inch, didn't flinch. He stood there, still and silent, as though waiting for something. Razor wasn't one to back down. Not now, not in front of his gang. "I said, who the hell are you?" The figure finally spoke, his voice low and calm, as though he had expected the question. "You're making a mistake." Razor sneered. "And what's that supposed to mean?" The figure stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Razor, and for a split second, Razor felt an icy chill run down his spine. Something about the stranger's eyes, it was like he could see right through him. It was unnerving. "I saw what happened," the figure continued. "What you don't understand is that you've already lost." Razor's eyes narrowed. "Lost? What the hell do you know about it?" The stranger's voice remained steady. "Chuck Norris is not a man you challenge lightly. What happened tonight, it was just the beginning. You have no idea what you're dealing with." A tense silence filled the air. The bikers shifted uneasily, none of them willing to speak. They didn't know who this man was, but the last thing they wanted was to be caught in the middle of something they didn't understand. "I don't care who the hell he is," Razor said, his voice growing harsh. "I'm not going to let him walk all over me. We're going to find him and settle this once and for all." The figure didn't respond right away. He simply watched Razor with those piercing eyes, as if weighing something important. "You have no idea what you're asking for," the figure said finally, his voice filled with an odd sense of warning. "Chuck Norris isn't just a fighter. He's a force, one that doesn't let go once it has you in its grip." Razor scoffed. "You're making him sound like a god or something." The figure's lips twitched into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Maybe he is. But even gods can fall. Just don't expect it to be easy." With that, the stranger turned and walked into the darkness once again, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. The bikers stood frozen, unsure of what to make of the strange encounter. "All right," Razor said after a long pause, his voice laced with frustration. "Let's go find him." But something had changed. The certainty in his voice had wavered, and his crew could sense it. No one spoke. But the unease in the air was palpable. They all knew they were about to embark on something bigger than they had anticipated. They were chasing a mystery they didn't fully understand. The next few hours passed in a blur of uncertainty. The gang rode through the streets, scouring every corner of the city for Chuck Norris. The adrenaline from the earlier confrontation had worn off, replaced by a sense of growing doubt. Where was he? Why hadn't they found him yet? Every turn they took, every alley they checked, only deepened the mystery. It was as if Chuck Norris had vanished from the face of the earth. It didn't make sense. Razor wasn't used to losing track of his target. He was used to dominating every situation, to being the one who controlled the outcome. But Chuck Norris had proven that there were things beyond Razor's control. That was a realization Razor couldn't ignore. And it gnawed at him as they rode on through the night. The streets felt quieter now, as though the city itself was holding its breath. The lights overhead flickered, casting eerie shadows on the ground. There was a strange tension in the air, and Razor could feel it settling over him like a heavy blanket. He slammed his fist against the handlebars of his bike in frustration. "Where is he?" But just as the words left his mouth, something changed. A light appeared in the distance, a figure standing under a streetlight. It was Chuck Norris. The gang slowed down as they approached, their eyes locked on him. There he was, standing calmly in the same spot where they had first encountered him. This time, though, there was no surprise. There was no fear. It was as if Chuck had been waiting for them. The air around them seemed to grow still, as if the world itself had stopped moving. The bikers pulled up in a circle around Chuck, their engines growling in the night. "You came looking for me," Chuck said, his voice calm, almost distant. "And now, here you are." Razor gritted his teeth. "You think you can just walk away from this? Think again." Chuck didn't move. He didn't even flinch. He simply stared at Razor, his expression unreadable. The tension was thick, but there was no anger in Chuck's eyes. There was no fear. Just a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from him like a silent storm. "You're chasing something that doesn't exist," Chuck said, his voice steady, but heavy with something else. "Something deeper." Razor's jaw tightened. "And what's that supposed to mean?" Chuck's eyes locked onto Razor's. "It means that no matter what you do, no matter how hard you fight, you'll never win. Not against me. Not against the things I've already faced." A chill ran down Razor's spine. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the man standing before him to be so calm, so unshakable. And for the first time, Razor wondered if he had bitten off more than he could chew. The gang remained silent, their eyes darting between Chuck and Razor. They, too, were feeling the weight of this moment, unsure of where it would lead. Razor took a step forward, his fists clenched. "I don't care what you've been through. I'm not backing down." Chuck didn't respond. He simply turned and began to walk away. "You think this is over?" Razor shouted, but Chuck didn't turn around. The figure continued walking into the night, as though Razor and his gang didn't exist. His confidence was almost maddening. And just like that, the gang was left with more questions than answers. Razor stared at Chuck's retreating form, a sense of uncertainty creeping into his chest. There was something Chuck had said that stuck with him. "You'll never win." What did that mean? What had he gone through? The mystery deepened, and Razor knew one thing for sure: this was far from over. The darkness of the night had only deepened as the gang rode through the streets, but something had shifted. Chuck Norris's presence haunted the air around them, like an unseen force that was always just out of reach. Each turn, each alley, each corner they passed seemed to pulse with an energy they couldn't grasp. Razor sat at the head of the group, his fingers clenched tightly around the throttle of his bike. He didn't know why he felt the need to keep chasing Chuck. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It wasn't about proving who was stronger or more dominant. It was something deeper, a strange urge to confront the unknown, to challenge the impossible. For the first time in years, Razor felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: uncertainty. The gang had been riding for hours, and they still hadn't found Chuck. It was as if the man had vanished off the face of the earth, and that bothered Razor more than he cared to admit. There was no trace, no sign of where he might have gone, but the memory of their first encounter still clung to the air like a storm waiting to break. "Where the hell is he?" one of the bikers muttered from behind him. Razor didn't respond. He couldn't. The city seemed endless, and no matter how many streets they rode down, Chuck Norris was nowhere to be found. It was maddening. Razor's grip on his bike tightened as his frustration grew. But deep down, something else had begun to gnaw at him. Something unsettled him, but he wasn't sure what it was. As they rounded another corner, Razor spotted a familiar figure standing in the distance. There, beneath a flickering streetlight, was Chuck Norris. This time, there was no hesitation. There was no moment of surprise. Razor's gang immediately revved their engines and rode toward him, the rumbling noise filling the quiet street. When they reached Chuck, they slowed down, circling him like wolves around their prey. Chuck didn't even flinch. He stood there, calm and unbothered, as if nothing had changed since their first encounter. "Are you done running?" Razor asked, his voice laced with anger. "You think you can just disappear?" Chuck's expression didn't change. "I didn't disappear. You just haven't figured out where I've gone." There was something about Chuck's words that made Razor's heart skip a beat. He was speaking in riddles, and that made Razor feel like the ground beneath him was shifting. It wasn't just about fighting anymore. It was about something bigger, something Chuck wasn't saying. "You've been running around in circles all night," Chuck continued, his voice steady. "You think you're in control. But you're not." Razor opened his mouth to respond, but Chuck held up a hand, silencing him. "The fight isn't with me," Chuck said, his eyes locking with Razor's. "The fight is with yourself. And until you understand that, this will never end." Razor's blood boiled. "What are you talking about?" He stepped closer, his fist clenched, ready to throw a punch, but Chuck didn't move. He didn't even flinch. There was something in Chuck's eyes, something calm, almost pitying, that made Razor pause. Chuck spoke again, his voice low and firm. "You've spent your life trying to prove yourself. But in the end, it's all pointless. It's not about the fight. It's about what happens when the fight is over." The words hung in the air like a challenge, but Razor wasn't sure what Chuck meant. He had heard people speak like this before, old men, wise men, people who had already lived through the battles Razor was only beginning to face. But that didn't make it any easier to understand. "I don't need lessons," Razor snapped, his voice harsh. "I'm not some kid. I've fought my way to the top. And I'm not backing down now." Chuck didn't respond right away. He simply stood there, his presence heavy in the silence that followed. The bikers around Razor shifted uneasily, their eyes flicking between their leader and the man they couldn't understand. Chuck took a step back, as though preparing to leave, but then he stopped and turned to face them one last time. "You'll find out soon enough," Chuck said, his voice steady but filled with something deeper, something Razor couldn't place. "You'll find out what happens when you keep fighting for the wrong reasons." And just like that, Chuck turned and walked away into the night, leaving the bikers stunned and confused. The gang watched Chuck disappear into the shadows, and for a moment, no one spoke. It was as if the world had paused. Razor was still processing Chuck's words, his mind racing, but the rest of the bikers were clearly uneasy. "What does he mean by that?" one of the bikers asked, his voice hesitant. Razor didn't answer immediately. He didn't know. But a part of him felt like he was on the edge of something he didn't fully understand. "We need to find him again," Razor said, though his voice lacked the certainty it had earlier. "We're not done yet." But even as he said the words, a creeping doubt gnawed at him. He didn't know why Chuck was so calm, why he seemed to know things Razor couldn't grasp, but Razor knew one thing: there was more to this than a simple fight. The bikers nodded, though they, too, seemed uncertain. The chase had become something else, something deeper. And the question hanging in the air was no longer about who was stronger or who would win the fight. It was about why Chuck Norris was so calm, so unfazed by everything they threw at him. Hours passed, and the gang continued their search. They rode through the city, scanning every street, every alley, but Chuck Norris was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had vanished again, slipping through their fingers like sand. Razor couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something, something crucial. Chuck's words echoed in his mind, playing over and over again. "The fight isn't with me. The fight is with yourself." What the hell did that mean? Razor wasn't sure. He had always thought that the fight was about proving himself, about showing the world that he was the strongest. But Chuck had made it clear that wasn't the case. The silence stretched on, growing thicker with each passing minute. The bikers' engines hummed beneath them, but the sound felt hollow, distant. And then, just as the last traces of hope began to fade, Razor saw something, a flicker of movement in the distance. A figure. Chuck Norris. This time, he wasn't standing under a streetlight. This time, he was walking into the heart of a dark alley, almost as though he wanted them to follow. Without a word, Razor revved his engine and sped down the street, the gang following close behind. But something was different this time. The chase felt heavier. There was a strange weight to it that none of them could explain. They reached the alley, and Chuck was standing there, waiting. His eyes flicked over the group of bikers, but he didn't seem surprised to see them. "You're still here," Chuck said, his voice low but steady. Razor gritted his teeth, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. "We're not done yet, old man. Not until we finish this." Chuck nodded slowly. "I never said we were done. But if you keep going down this path, you'll never find the answer you're looking for." Razor's patience snapped. "Enough with the cryptic bullshit. What do you want from us?" Chuck's expression softened, and for a moment, he almost looked sad. "What I want," he said quietly, "is for you to stop running. To stop fighting for the wrong reasons." And then, without another word, he turned and walked away once more, disappearing into the darkness of the alley. Razor stood there, his fists clenched, his mind racing. The mystery of Chuck Norris had only deepened. But with every encounter, Razor found himself more and more unsure of his next move. The streets had grown quieter since their last encounter with Chuck Norris, but Razor could still feel the tension lingering in the air like the calm before a storm. The night was thick, almost oppressive, and the gang continued their pursuit with a sense of urgency, but also something else, a strange hesitancy that none of them could explain. They weren't just chasing a man anymore. It felt like they were chasing a shadow, a mystery that refused to reveal itself. Razor's mind was a whirlwind of questions. What was Chuck's game? What did he want? And more importantly, why was he trying to teach them something they didn't want to learn? Razor had never been one to back down from a fight, but Chuck wasn't just any opponent. Chuck was a riddle wrapped in a mystery. Every time Razor thought he had him figured out, Chuck slipped through his fingers like water. They had been riding for hours, winding their way through the city streets, past darkened buildings and forgotten alleyways. The cool night air cut through Razor's jacket, but it did little to ease the tension coiling in his chest. His thoughts kept circling back to Chuck's words. "The fight isn't with me. The fight is with yourself." What did that even mean? Where the hell is he? Razor muttered, more to himself than to the rest of the gang. He could feel the unease spreading among the bikers. It wasn't just the uncertainty of their target's whereabouts. It was something deeper, something unspoken that hung in the air between them. One of the bikers, a man named Skid, pulled up beside Razor, his eyes darting nervously around the street. "Maybe we should just back off, Razor. I mean, we've tried everything. The guy's like a ghost. We're never gonna catch him." Razor shot him a hard look. "Back off? Are you out of your mind? We're not giving up now. Not after everything we've been through. Not after what he's done to us." Skid raised his hands in surrender. "I'm just saying, maybe it's time we accept that we're in over our heads. You saw the way he looked at us. Like he knew everything we were thinking. Like he's always 3 steps ahead." Razor clenched his jaw, but Skid's words stuck with him. There was truth in them. Chuck Norris wasn't just some guy they could muscle into submission. He was something else. Something untouchable. And that fact gnawed at Razor more than he cared to admit. They rode in silence for several minutes, the sound of their bikes echoing off the empty streets. The further they went, the more it felt like they were losing their grip on reality, like the chase itself was spiraling out of control. And then, just as Razor thought they might be on the verge of giving up, they spotted him. Chuck Norris. This time, there was no grand entrance, no dramatic moment. He was simply standing at the edge of a parking lot, his back to them, as if waiting for them to catch up. His silhouette was framed by the pale glow of the streetlights, but there was something about him that seemed different. Calmer. More at peace. Razor's heart raced, but this time, there was no adrenaline-fueled rage. There was only a growing sense of dread, something primal that told him this encounter would be unlike any other. The gang slowed their bikes as they approached Chuck, each of them unsure of what to do. For the first time, they didn't know how to face him. They didn't know what kind of challenge awaited them this time. Chuck turned slowly to face them, his expression unreadable. "You're still chasing me," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We're not backing down," Razor spat, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "We're not scared of you, Chuck. We've come this far. We're finishing this." Chuck's eyes softened, and for the briefest of moments, Razor thought he saw something resembling sympathy in them. "You don't understand," Chuck said, his tone almost sad. "This fight isn't one you can win with strength or fury. It's not about proving who's tougher. It's about something deeper." Razor felt a flicker of frustration rise in his chest. "I'm done with your cryptic nonsense, Chuck. Just tell us what you want. Why are you doing this? Why don't you just fight us like a man?" Chuck stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "Fighting isn't about strength. It's about control. The fight you're in isn't with me. It's with yourselves." Razor's fists clenched at his sides. "What the hell is that supposed to mean? You think we're scared? You think we're weak?" Chuck shook his head slowly. "No, Razor. I'm not saying you're weak. I'm saying you're lost. You're running from something, but you don't even know what it is." The words hit Razor like a slap to the face. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. There was something about Chuck's voice that made him question everything he had believed up until this point. Something in Chuck's eyes that made him feel exposed, vulnerable. Razor didn't like it. He didn't like the way Chuck was making him feel. "You think you're invincible," Chuck continued, "but there's always something stronger than you. There's always something more powerful than your fists. You're running from your own fears, and you don't even realize it." Razor took a step back, his chest tightening. The words were too close to home. Too real. He had spent his entire life proving he was tough, that he was the strongest. He had built his entire identity around that image. But now he wasn't so sure. "You don't get it," Razor said, his voice shaking with frustration. "We've been through hell. We've fought wars, battled our demons, and come out on top. No one's stronger than us." Chuck's expression remained calm, but his eyes never left Razor's. "Strength isn't the answer, Razor. You can fight all you want. But until you learn to face the fight within yourself, you'll never truly win." The silence between them stretched for what felt like an eternity. Razor stood there, staring at Chuck, and for the first time, he didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to respond to the truth Chuck was speaking. Finally, Chuck spoke again, his voice low but carrying weight. "You're looking for answers in the wrong places. You think you'll find what you're searching for in battle. But what you really need is peace." And then, without another word, Chuck turned and walked away. But this time, Razor didn't feel the same rush of anger he had before. This time, he felt lost. For the first time in his life, Razor wasn't sure who he was or what he was fighting for. The gang stood in stunned silence, their eyes shifting uneasily from one to another. Razor's mind was a storm of confusion. What was Chuck trying to say? What had just happened? He didn't know. But one thing was certain, this wasn't over. Not yet. As the gang turned their bikes around and rode back into the night, Razor's mind raced. Chuck had left them with more questions than answers, and each one of those questions dug into him like a splinter, making it impossible to ignore. Razor didn't know what was coming next. But one thing was clear, this chase, this fight, had only just begun. Razor couldn't shake Chuck's words. They echoed in his mind like a relentless drumbeat, growing louder with each passing moment. The fight isn't with me. The fight is with yourself. What did it mean? How could it possibly make sense? The gang had gathered at their usual hangout, the low hum of motorcycle engines filling the air. The familiar smells of gasoline and engine oil mixed with the bitter scent of doubt that hung heavily over Razor. His mind was a storm of questions, and no one could offer answers. They didn't understand. To them, it was just another challenge, another fight to win. But to Razor, it was something else entirely. It felt like they were playing in a game they didn't even know the rules to. He leaned against the cool metal of his bike, his hands clenched tightly around the handlebars. His thoughts kept circling back to Chuck. The way he'd spoken, so calm, so confident, as if he knew something Razor didn't. But what? What could Chuck possibly know that Razor didn't? He had lived through battles, both physical and mental. He had fought harder than anyone. He had nothing to fear. Or so he thought. You gonna sit there all night, or you gonna tell us what's on your mind? Skid's voice broke through Razor's spiraling thoughts. Razor looked up to find the rest of the gang staring at him, waiting for him to speak. But he couldn't. He didn't know what to say. His pride, his ego, the very foundation of his identity, had been shaken, and he wasn't sure how to rebuild it. Skid's expression softened. I know you're pissed, man. But we can't just keep riding around in circles. If we're gonna finish this, we need to know what we're up against. Chuck's not playing by our rules. Hell, he's not even playing by his own. Razor's gaze flickered toward the dark street ahead. I know. And I don't know what to do about it. There was silence for a moment as the gang processed his words. No one spoke. They didn't know what to say either. They had been riding hard, chasing a ghost, and with each attempt to confront Chuck, they only found themselves more lost. What if he's right? Razor muttered, almost to himself. Skid frowned. What do you mean? Razor straightened up, his eyes distant. What if the fight's not about winning? What if it's about something else? Something deeper? The words hung in the air, and Razor immediately regretted saying them. He had no answers, only confusion. But in the silence that followed, he felt the weight of his own doubt. It was a strange feeling, one he had never allowed himself to experience. Doubt was for the weak. And Razor was no weakling. I'm done running, Razor finally said, his voice hardening with resolve. Chuck wants us to face ourselves, fine. But that doesn't mean I'm gonna back down. I'm gonna find him. I'm gonna finish this. There was a collective murmur of agreement from the gang. They didn't fully understand, but they trusted Razor. And that was enough. The next day, they were back on the road, the sound of their bikes rumbling through the streets like a storm on the horizon. But this time, Razor wasn't just chasing Chuck Norris. He was chasing something inside himself. Something that, until now, he had refused to acknowledge. They rode for hours, through neighborhoods they didn't know, past streets that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. Razor's mind wasn't on the road, though. It was on Chuck. And the more he thought about Chuck's words, the more a sense of unease settled in his gut. Was Chuck really just trying to teach them a lesson? Or was there something more to this whole ordeal? What if there was more to Chuck than anyone could imagine? They turned down a side street, their headlights cutting through the fog that had begun to roll in. Razor's heart rate quickened as they reached an old warehouse at the end of the road. The building was abandoned, its windows dark and empty. But something about it felt different. It felt like the place they were meant to find. It was almost as if it had been waiting for them. "This is it," Razor said, his voice low. "He's here." The gang parked their bikes and approached the warehouse cautiously, the air thick with tension. Razor could feel his heart pounding in his chest as they neared the entrance. The building loomed before them like a dark shadow, its silent presence both intimidating and strangely inviting. They reached the door, and Razor pushed it open. Inside was pitch black, save for the faint glow of a single light bulb hanging overhead. The air smelled musty, like years of dust had settled in the corners. It was quiet. Too quiet. "Chuck!" Razor called out, his voice echoing off the walls. No response. He took a step forward. His boots echoing in the empty space. His gang followed closely behind, their faces tense, their hands resting on their weapons. They were ready for whatever came next. And then, from the shadows, Chuck Norris stepped into view. His expression was calm, almost serene, as though he had been expecting them. His eyes seemed to glow in the dim light, their intensity unwavering. "You've come," Chuck said, his voice soft but powerful. "I've been waiting." Razor's blood boiled at the sight of him. He was tired of this game. Tired of Chuck's mind games. "I'm done with your cryptic speeches, Chuck. I'm done with running. What do you want from us?" Chuck tilted his head, his eyes never leaving Razor's. "I want you to understand, Razor. The fight isn't out there. It's in here." He pointed to his chest, then to Razor's. "It's about what you carry inside of you. The fear. The anger. The pain." Razor's fists clenched. "What the hell are you talking about? We're not scared of you." Chuck smiled softly. "No. But you're scared of something. And until you face it, you will never be free." Razor stepped forward, his patience wearing thin. "Enough with the riddles, Chuck. I want you to fight me. I want you to prove that you're stronger than me." Chuck's smile faded. "Strength isn't measured by fists. It's measured by control. By understanding your own mind. Your own heart." The words hit Razor harder than he expected. He took a step back, his mind racing. What was Chuck trying to say? Was this really about strength? Or was it something else? "I've fought battles all my life," Razor said, his voice trembling with frustration. "I've been through hell, and I've come out on top every time. What makes you think you can teach me anything?" Chuck took a step forward, his presence overwhelming. "Because I know what it's like to lose yourself in the fight. To think that winning is all that matters. But winning isn't everything. And neither is fighting. There's something more. Something you need to learn." Razor shook his head, unable to fully grasp what Chuck was trying to say. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, of emotions he didn't know how to process. The anger, the fear, the pride, it was all mixing together into something he couldn't control. He had always believed that power came from victory. But Chuck's words were shaking that belief, piece by piece. "You don't have to fight me, Razor," Chuck said, his voice low but steady. "You're fighting yourself. And until you realize that, nothing will change." For the first time, Razor didn't know how to respond. His hands were shaking, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. Chuck had broken through the armor Razor had spent years building. He had exposed something deep inside him, a weakness he had refused to acknowledge. But Razor wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet. Not in front of Chuck. He turned and walked toward the door. "We're done here," he muttered, his voice strained. "We'll finish this. On my terms." As he left the warehouse, the weight of Chuck's words lingered. Razor wasn't sure what the fight was really about anymore, but he knew one thing for sure: this was far from over. Razor's hands gripped the handlebars of his bike as he revved the engine. The roar of the machine drowned out the voices in his head, but it couldn't block the turmoil that churned within him. For the past few days, Chuck's words haunted him, echoing in the back of his mind, refusing to be silenced. "You're fighting yourself. Not me. Not the world. Yourself." He shook his head. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to think about it. All his life, Razor had believed that victory was about strength, about taking down his enemies and showing them who was in charge. He had fought wars on the streets, survived the toughest challenges, and carved his path through a world that didn't care about him. He had won every battle. Or so he thought. But now, he was starting to feel like he had been fighting the wrong battle all along. The gang was in their usual spot, the familiar clatter of motorcycles and the buzz of conversation filling the air. They were waiting for Razor, as always, but something was different today. They had been with him through thick and thin, but lately, Razor had felt like an outsider in his own crew. The confidence he had once worn like armor had begun to crack, and they could sense it. Skid, who had always been Razor's right hand, approached him first. "You good, man?" he asked, his voice low. Razor met his gaze, but for the first time, he wasn't sure how to answer. He opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? He wasn't sure anymore. "I'm fine," he finally muttered, though it didn't sound convincing, even to himself. Skid didn't push it. He just nodded and gave Razor a sidelong glance. "You know, we're in this together, right? No matter what." Razor nodded absently, though his mind was a million miles away. He had always prided himself on being a leader, on being the one who kept the gang moving forward. But now, the weight of responsibility felt like a burden he didn't know how to bear. "I'll be fine," Razor repeated, more to himself than to Skid. The gang fell silent, sensing the tension in the air. Razor could feel their eyes on him, the unspoken questions hanging between them like an invisible wall. They were worried about him, but Razor didn't know how to ask for their help. He didn't know how to ask for anything. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the street, Razor made up his mind. He had to confront Chuck again. He had to face whatever was eating away at him, or he would never find peace. But this time, it wasn't about proving himself. It wasn't about winning the fight. It was about something deeper. Something that Chuck had tried to show him. The ride to the warehouse was quiet, the hum of the engines the only sound as Razor led the gang down the familiar route. The warehouse loomed ahead, its dilapidated structure standing like a monument to everything that had brought them to this point. When they arrived, Chuck was waiting. He stood in the same spot as before, his back straight, his expression unreadable. His eyes locked onto Razor's the moment he stepped off his bike. "You've returned," Chuck said simply, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Razor didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, feeling the weight of Chuck's gaze. It was as if Chuck could see straight through him, past the bravado, past the tough exterior, to the confusion and fear that lurked beneath. "You've been thinking," Chuck continued, his voice gentle but firm. "And that's good. You've been running from yourself for too long. But now, it's time to face the truth." Razor swallowed hard, his throat dry. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but this time, it wasn't from anger. It was from something else, something deeper. "I don't know what you want from me," Razor said, his voice strained. "I don't know what any of this means." Chuck didn't move. "It means you're ready," he said simply. "You fought every battle on the outside, but now it's time to fight the one inside. That's where true strength comes from." Razor's fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms. "I don't need a lesson in strength, Chuck. I've been through hell. I've survived things most people would never even dream of. What's the point of all this?" Chuck's gaze never wavered. The point is, Razor, that strength doesn't come from what you've been through. It comes from what you can overcome. And the hardest thing to overcome is yourself. For a moment, Razor didn't know how to respond. The words stung, but they also rang with a truth he couldn't ignore. His whole life had been a series of battles, and he had won them all, or so he had thought. But now, standing before Chuck, he realized that winning wasn't everything. There was something more. The gang stood off to the side, watching the confrontation unfold. They had no idea what was going on, but they could feel the tension. Skid, the ever-watchful second-in-command, kept glancing at the others, his expression unreadable. Razor took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He couldn't keep running from the truth. He had to face it, no matter how much it scared him. "I'm done fighting," Razor said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm done trying to prove something. I don't need to be the strongest. I don't need to be the toughest. I just need to be." Chuck's eyes softened, and for the first time, Razor saw something else in them. Not just the calm, unwavering strength, but something that felt like understanding. Like Chuck had been where Razor was, once upon a time. "Good," Chuck said, his voice warm with approval. "That's the first step. The fight was never with me, Razor. It was always with you. Now, you've won." Razor stood there, stunned. For a moment, it felt like the world had shifted beneath his feet. He didn't know what had just happened, but he felt something change. It was like a weight had been lifted from his chest, a burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying. And for the first time, Razor felt free. As they made their way back to their bikes, Razor couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. He wasn't sure if it was just Chuck's words or something deeper within himself. But whatever it was, it felt like a turning point. Skid caught up with him as they reached their bikes. "So, what now?" he asked, a note of curiosity in his voice. Razor paused, looking out over the street as the sun dipped below the horizon. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he didn't need to. He was no longer chasing a victory that didn't matter. He had found something far more important. "We move forward," Razor said, his voice steady. "But we do it on our own terms.